Understanding Sweden, Episode 8, 200 Years in One Evening. 200 years ago, Sweden was what we'd today call the middle of nowhere. A typical farming country. Almost everyone lived off the land, working the soil and keeping animals. The towns were small, and compared to the rest of Europe, Sweden back then was a poor country. That's worth fixing in your mind before any other date. There was never some original Swedish prosperity. 200 years is very little time, about 6 generations. A lot changed in the 19th century. Efficient machines were invented, and industry grew all over Europe. Sweden started turning into an industrial society. People moved to the towns and went to work in factories. At the same time, something happened that always comes with life getting better. At the start of the 19th century, about 2.5 million people lived in Sweden. 100 years later, the population had doubled. There were 2 reasons: better farming methods, which produced more food, and advances in medicine, which meant fewer children died of illness. And now something worth remembering for everyone who's come here today. Sweden was still poor, and many people couldn't find work. So many chose to leave. More than 1 million Swedes emigrated to the United States between 1850 and 1920, hoping for a better life. 1 million people, from a country of only 5 million, 1 in 5. This country knows what it means to pack a suitcase and go somewhere the pay is supposed to be better. We're just traveling the same road in the other direction. The first big industries appeared in the middle of the 19th century. Sawmills producing timber and works producing steel. Little by little, more factories were built. Shoe factories, clothing factories, engineering works. People moved into the towns, and that changed housing, the job market, and the whole infrastructure. Let's remember from this part. 200 years ago, Sweden was a poor farming country. The population grew from 2.5 million to double that in 100 years, thanks to farming and medicine. More than 1 million Swedes left for the USA between 1850 and 1920. The first big industries were sawmills and steel. For a long time, power in Sweden was held by the king, the nobility, the church, the merchants, and the farmers. But as society industrialized and became more modern, more and more people started demanding that the political system change too. The first big change came in 1809. Parliament passed a new fundamental law that limited the king's power. Then, in 1865, another change to the fundamental law gave the vote to more people, and the nobility and the clergy lost the political influence they'd had for centuries. These were important changes, but this still wasn't democracy. And here's why. Women still couldn't vote, and they couldn't be elected to political office. Among men, only those with a certain income or a certain amount of property could vote, and the richest men had several votes each. Let's stop there for a second. This isn't a rich man's vote counted for more as a figure of speech. He literally had more than one. It took the country 60 years to get from that system to the one we have now, where everyone has exactly one vote. And it didn't happen on its own. The most important thing that made real democracy possible was the popular movements. People organized to demand their rights: an 8-hour working day, the right to vote, freedom of religion. These were voluntary associations that brought people together around shared interests. Many of them still exist today. Hundreds of thousands of people were already taking part in this work in the 19th century. They opened their own libraries and study circles and held meetings for their members. The 4 biggest movements were the workers' movement, the free church movement, the women's movement, and the temperance movement. And here's something important about their methods. The popular movements used legal ways to push their demands. Demonstrations in the streets and squares, protest meetings, books and newspaper articles. Not rebellion, pressure within the law. And it worked. In 1909, Parliament changed the law so that almost all men got the right to vote. The women's movement now pushed especially hard to make sure this applied to women as well. The decision on universal suffrage came in 1918, after years of protests and political unrest. And in 1921 came the first parliamentary election where both men and women voted, and where women could be elected as members of parliament. That's the moment Sweden became a democracy. Let's remember 3 dates. 1809, the king's power was limited. 1918, the decision on universal suffrage. 1921, the first election with both men and women, and Sweden became a democracy. And 4 popular movements: the workers' movement, the free churches, the women's movement, and the temperance movement. During the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, Sweden declared itself neutral. But even staying out of the war, the country suffered from shortages of food and other important goods, and that led to demonstrations and protests. In the 20s and 30s, society kept modernizing. New technology changed everyday life. More people got electricity, for example. Housing slowly got better, though many still lived in cramped spaces without an indoor flushing toilet. But the years after the breakthrough of democracy were also restless. There were big conflicts between employers and workers. Many people had no job, and class differences were still wide. Strikes for better pay and better working conditions were nothing unusual. And in 1931, something happened that people in this country still remember. In a place called Ådalen, the military fired on workers who were out demonstrating. Several people were killed. It shook Sweden and showed just how deep the conflicts ran. Now watch the gap. 7 years. Many people wanted to find peaceful ways to settle conflicts, and in 1938, employers and the unions signed an agreement in Saltsjöbaden, just outside Stockholm. That's why it's called the Saltsjöbaden Agreement. It became the basis for cooperation between unions and employers, and it laid the foundation for what people call the Swedish model. Here's what that model means. Employers and unions, not politicians, negotiate the conditions on the labour market, in those collective agreements we talked about in the episode on work. The Swedish model still shapes how wages and working conditions are set here. So there's the first half of the idea, the habit of negotiating. The one people use today to explain the Swedish character appeared 7 years after workers were shot at. That's not a gentle nation. That's a conclusion drawn after a funeral. And there's one more idea from the same period. This one about the state. In 1928, the Social Democratic leader Per Albin Hansson put forward the idea of the people's home. He described it as a society where everyone could feel secure and part of something, no matter where they came from, and where class differences and political divisions would shrink. The country was to be thought of as a home, not a territory. Let's remember, 1931, Ådalen, the military fired on demonstrators. 1938, the Saltsjöbaden Agreement and the foundation of the Swedish model, where working conditions are set by employers and unions, not by politicians. 1928, Per Albin Hansson and the idea of the people's home. Now, an honest question. If a home was being built for everyone, was it really built for everyone? No. Modern society, the one that grew up in the 30s, slowly made life better for most people, but not for all. And the textbook says so directly. First example, the racism that was common at the time. There were so-called racial biological studies, and minorities suffered from them. Sami people, Tornedalians, Jews, and Roma. Parliament also passed special laws that made it harder for certain groups, Roma and Jews, to immigrate to Sweden. Second example, people who were considered unsuitable for society were placed in hospitals and other care institutions, sometimes for the rest of their lives. This happened above all to people with mental illness and to people with disabilities. And it's only recently that Sweden has faced this dark part of its history and given some redress to the people who were harmed. This is worth hearing calmly. The country we're studying in this textbook wasn't a model from the start. It did what others did, and it admitted it late. Knowing this doesn't mean thinking less of it. It means understanding that all the rights we have today didn't come from kindness. They came from working through mistakes. In the Second World War, from 39 to 45, Sweden again stayed neutral and stayed out of the fighting. But the country ended up in difficult situations more than once. When Finland was attacked by the Soviet Union, and when Nazi Germany occupied Denmark and Norway. To lower the risk of being pulled into the war, the Swedish government let German soldiers travel through Sweden on their way to occupied Norway and to Finland. Neutral on paper, but in practice, giving in to the stronger side. During the Holocaust, when the Nazis murdered around 6 million of Europe's Jews, Sweden changed how it acted. In the 30s, the country had a harsh policy that made it hard for Jews to move there. That strict policy continued through the first years of the war, so very few people managed to find safety in Sweden back then. Toward the end of the war, the policy changed, and Sweden did several things to help. About 7,000 Danish Jews escaped to Sweden thanks to a Danish-Swedish rescue operation. The Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg issued protective passports to Jews, papers showing that the person was under Swedish protection and couldn't be sent to a concentration camp. And at the end of the war, the Red Cross rescued thousands of Jews from German concentration camps. They were driven across the border into Sweden on white buses. Let's remember, in the 30s, racial biological studies and laws against Roma and Jewish immigration, people with mental illness placed in institutions, sometimes for life. In both world wars, Sweden was neutral. German soldiers were allowed to travel through. About 7,000 Danish Jews were rescued. Raoul Wallenberg issued protective passports. The Red Cross brought people out on white buses. After the Second World War, Sweden went through a long stretch of strong economic growth. Unemployment was very low, industry was doing well, and people's standard of living rose fast. The Social Democrats had a lot of support from voters, and for most of that time they held government power themselves, from 1945 all the way to 1976. A strong economy made it possible to carry out big, wide-reaching reforms. That's why this period is often called Sweden's record years. Here's what working people actually got. It's worth hearing the whole list because we still live with it today. The right to a 40-hour working week, with Saturdays off. 5 weeks of holiday on full pay. The right to paid holiday changed the everyday life of a factory worker more than any political speech ever did. Better wages meant more people could buy a car, get a summer cottage, and travel abroad on holiday. Healthcare and elderly care were expanded and improved. The social safety net, child benefit, sickness insurance, pensions, got better too. Many of the rights and security systems Sweden has today started right here, in this period. And this is where a turning point happened, the reason we're listening to this course at all. Strong economic development pulled people out of the countryside and into the cities. At the same time, many people came here from other countries to work, from Finland, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Turkey, for example. Sweden, which in the 19th century had been a country people emigrated from, became a country people immigrated to. Notice this: the first people to come weren't refugees, they were workers. They were invited because the factories didn't have enough hands. The fast move into the cities created a housing shortage. To solve it, the state launched what became known as the Million Program in the 60s. The goal was to build 1 million homes in 10 years. New neighborhoods grew up in the suburbs. The flats there were bigger and more modern than the ones in the city centers, and there were shops, healthcare, and schools nearby. Equality grew during the record years too. The wage gap between men and women got smaller. More and more women started working outside the home, and to make that possible, childcare was expanded. The 60s were a decade when young people protested against injustice and took peace, the environment, and international solidarity seriously. That's also when the way people addressed each other changed. People started saying "du" to each other instead of using titles and the formal "you." It sounds like a small thing, but it reflected a more equal society too. And one more change from the same time. In the early 60s, television arrived, and it changed how people got their news and their entertainment. Let's remember, the record years, 1945 to 1976, the 40-hour week and 5 weeks of paid holiday. Sweden became a country of immigration, and the first to arrive were workers from Finland, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Turkey. The Million Program of the 60s, 1 million homes in 10 years, and the reform in how people addressed each other, saying "du." Since the mid-70s, Sweden has gone through one more big transformation. The industrial society became an information society, a knowledge society. But at first, it felt like an economic crisis. Competition grew. Countries in other parts of the world started making goods more cheaply. Several large Swedish factories did so badly that they had to close, and unemployment went up. Partly as a reaction to the crisis, in 1976, Sweden got a government that wasn't social democratic. That was the start of a series of governments taking turns, social democratic and right-wing. In the information society, technology started developing fast, and that changed how people looked at education. People needed to study more. Universities and colleges were expanded, and people stayed in education longer than before. There was a growing need for lifelong learning. Knowledge went out of date quickly because technology was moving faster and faster. Out of the same need came more opportunities for adult education. In the 90s, immigration to Sweden started rising again. Now many people came as refugees, from dictatorships and from countries hit by war. At the same time, segregation and hostility toward outsiders were growing. So integration and the fight against exclusion became important in public debate and in politics. From the 80s on, the rights of the individual mattered more. More and more people wanted to choose for themselves, their school, for example, or their health care, and freedom of choice became a big political question. At the same time, the rights of children and of different minorities were strengthened, and there were more laws against discrimination. attitudes changed too, toward people with a different sexual orientation or a different gender expression, from strong discrimination to more and more acceptance. And the last big change, which started in the 90s and is still going on right in front of us, the digital revolution. Computers, the internet, smartphones, and lately artificial intelligence have changed how people work, study, talk to each other, and get information. Digitalization has made fast trade, international cooperation, and the exchange of information much easier. Today, Sweden has grown into a high-tech information society where digital technology and connections with the whole world are just part of everyday life. Let's gather 200 years into a single thought. A poor farming country that 1 person in 5 left. Votes that were sold to wealth until hundreds of thousands of people demanded something else, by legal means, through libraries, study circles, and newspaper articles. The shots at Odalen, and an agreement 7 years later. A home for everyone that not everyone was let into at first. Holidays, pensions, and child benefit, which came because the economy could afford them, not because someone suddenly got kinder. And workers from Finland, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Turkey, who were the beginning of something we're now part of ourselves. And from that comes a conclusion more useful than any date. Everything that feels natural and eternal in Sweden today, 1 vote each, 5 weeks of holiday, agreement instead of orders, has an author, a date, and a price. Which means it doesn't hold up on its own. It holds up the same way it was won, through taking part. Let's remember, from the mid-70s, the move to an information society and the crisis in industry. In 1976, the first government that wasn't social democratic. In the 90s, immigration as refuge from wars and dictatorships, growing segregation, and a turn toward integration. From the 80s, individual rights, freedom of choice, laws against discrimination. From the 90s, the digital revolution. That was the course Understanding Sweden. The material comes from the official Citizenship-Test textbook. Nothing added, nothing left out.